everyone, I'm Captain Logan. Welcome back to The Bunker. It's time once again for You Made Me Watch, and this time you made me watch The Shawshank Redemption, based on the short story by Stephen King. This was requested by John Early on Patreon, so thanks a lot to you. You know, I have always had an irrational fear of prisons. I'm not sure why. I've never done anything I can think of that should get me thrown into one, and I can't imagine doing the kind of thing that would send me to anything like the high-security prison in this film, but I have a fascination with prison life. It's why I watched Orange is the New Black when it first came out. I liked things about that first season, but it wasn't for me ultimately. I never continued past season 1, and it's why I've occasionally delved into true crime shows with incarcerated felons telling the story of how they came to be there, and shows about what prison life is like. It's not a morbid interest, I don't think. I don't really find it entertaining, per se. I guess I try to understand it, and I continue looking into it because I don't. I'm particularly interested in the difference between our prison system and prison systems that make a little bit more sense to me, like Germany's. My preoccupation must have something to do with how unnatural prison life seems, and how counter it often is to rehabilitation. In punishing our worst offenders, and sometimes the least dangerous, we put them in a place that is so contrary to their natural state of being, their natural state as human beings, that we make it difficult for them to feel human, which often makes them worse off psychologically than they were when they arrived, and completely defeats the purpose. It is, in my view, cruel and, in many circumstances, inhumane. Now, I don't bring this up to make a stand against prisons on the whole. Of course we need them, nor to say that prisoners never receive an education, or are allowed any pleasures at all, or never become better people behind bars. But I'm generally pretty critical of the institution as I understand it in this country, to the point that I sometimes have recurring dreams about winding up there. And this movie is critical of all of that too. So while I haven't been behind bars myself, and I don't know anyone who has, The Shawshank Redemption nevertheless resonated with me deeply. It effectively makes a lot of candid observations about the imperfections and cracks in the institution, with a narrative spanning over 20 years that begins in 1947, and illustrates that most of the problems with prisons today go back a long time. It comments on the dehumanization of prisoners, wrongful prosecution, corrupt jailers who take personal advantage of prisoners, institutionalization of prisoners, lack of funding from the government to give inmates what they need, and the apathy of prison administration. It's incredibly comprehensive in its critique of the system, while simultaneously telling a movie and surprisingly hopeful, character-driven story about an innocent man who gets thrown in prison and the friend he makes, whose attitude and outlook completely changes by his refusal to let this place break him, and his determination to live life on his own terms. If it was just a critique of prisons, that might as well be a paper, but this is also a really good story. Throughout most of the movie, you think it's about just one protagonist, Andy, with his friend Red, played brilliantly by Morgan Freeman, probably the best of his performances I've seen, filling in a lot of exposition in voiceover. He seems to be Watson to Andy's Holmes, until you have all the pieces to the puzzle at the end, and it turns out the more dramatic character arc is actually Red's, and arguably it's kind of his story all along. There's certainly an argument to be made for dual protagonist, but I rather look at this as a story of a man with no hope, who makes the best of his life in prison and subtly and subconsciously begins to find a sense of hope that leads to his release because of what Andy teaches him. They both get an arc. Andy is a character who refuses to change, but changes the world around him. Though again, I don't realize that's where it's going until that big revelation, that he's been tunneling his way out of the prison for 20 years. And Red is a character who seems unchangeable, but discovers a reason to live beyond the captivity he has become so accustomed to, totally despite himself. There's a fantastic command of narrative here, and it's really tightly woven and confident confidently told. Every detail matters, even if you don't understand its significance in the moment, and it has an incredible sense of setup and payoff. It constantly keeps me guessing, and then everything is solidly wrapped up at the end, but not in a cute and convenient way. It gets away with an ending that might watch sappy, were the rest of the film not brutally honest about what's wrong with the prison system, and wasn't populated by believable, flawed, and mostly sympathetic characters, except of course for the corrupt prison warden played by Bob Gunton, Leland Owsley from Daredevil. Basically the exact same uptight, conniving, heartless character if he existed in the 1950s. But I totally believe that guy too, even if I don't completely know how he got this way, because working at a prison has changed him, just like living in the prison has changed a lot of the inmates. The warden, Norton, is a God-fearing man, a Christian who really seems like he probably at one time tried to do the right thing in every situation, but taking advantage of the system and the inmates to create a money laundering scheme was just too tempting for him in such a thankless and unrewarding job. I spent a lot of the movie wondering with interest what kind of man he really was. There are clues that he might be capable of truly horrible things, like when he lets his guards beat up a new inmate just for having a nervous breakdown on the first night. And considering how humiliating getting processed at Shawshank is, getting hosed down and paraded to your cell in the nude, I don't know how everyone doesn't have that reaction. And that is our first impression of the warden. But he also shows Andy compassion when he gives him a job at the library and lets him write letters to the government in an attempt for funding for new books. And he seems to genuinely think the inmates will be better for reading their Bibles, which he insists are in every cell. But it turns out all of that is self-serving. He has an ulterior motive for every kindness he plays to Andy or anyone else. And it's all about keeping his scheme to skim money off the top for the prison's profits under wraps. There's an escalation with him, where more and more I'm seeing what he's willing to do to get rich and to save his own skin, and I'm realizing that he's as bad or worse as any inmate I've met. Yes, he throws Andy in the hole for a month to keep him from getting himself transferred after he meets a new inmate who knows who really killed Andy's wife and lover, the crime he was falsely accused of. But it's not until he has his right-hand man, Hadley, played by the leanest Clancy Brown I have ever seen, snipe that inmate so Andy's evidence is gone and he can't tell anyone outside about the dirt he has on Norton, that I realize just how cold and cruel he really is. I kept thinking there might be a chance for him to be redeemed, because I kept seeing what I thought were flashes of humanity, but might have all just been flashes of calculation. But of course I'm looking for redemption everywhere, because that word is in the title, and I'm not sure for a long time if my perceived protagonist, Andy, has anything he needs to be redeemed for. He's not a perfect person, and he blames himself for his wife's murder because he drove her into the arms of another man, and that led to her getting killed, but we learn for certain when the real killer's bunkmate shows up that Andy is innocent of that crime. But he's a real mystery at the beginning. Everyone is suspicious of him until they get to know him, because he's stoic, doesn't let things faze him, and has the steely eyes of a killer. And that's a great point of identity in the film. The face of a killer doesn't make you a killer, but even if you're innocent, if you spend enough time behind bars, you may come to believe that maybe you belong there. Even Andy, who never stops hoping he can get himself out and isn't broken by the stone walls that break most everyone else, can't fully escape becoming, as Red says, institutionalized. I love how long it takes before I can really trust Andy is telling the truth. At first, I'm wondering if he's an unreliable narrator when he swears he's innocent at the beginning, and especially when Red says everyone is innocent at Shawshank, a phrase that's repeated a number of times through the film. Red is the only person there who admits to his wrongdoing, and at least amongst the principal cast, Andy is the only one who really is innocent as he claims. These are both moral guys who want to make the prison a better place for the other inmates, but I could really have seen it going either way with either of them in several places, just as I wasn't totally sure what kind of man the warden would turn out to be. I'm made to like and root for Andy constantly, and by the scene where he locks his guard in the warden's bathroom and plays an opera for the whole prison yard, yard, he's won me over completely, and I almost don't care if he did it or not. But I think, as cliche as it could have been, the scenario that he really is innocent is more interesting, for two reasons. He's a great mirror for Red, who is a criminal, but who has become a completely different and better person after 40 years behind bars. 40 years by the end of the movie, anyway. In contrast to Andy, who did nothing wrong and has to work hard not to become a worse person, to transform into something closer to what the judge thought he was who put him away while in prison. It's also more interesting because, again, of the critique of the system that put him away. Partly just because that judge looked him in the eyes and confused introversion for lack of empathy. I also love the way the story invites viewers to actively put the pieces together and figure out who these people are without holding our hands. As I said, I'm suspicious of a lot of these people through a lot of the movie, and especially because I reviewed this film's companion piece, The Green Mile, not too long ago, which is a bleaker story with arguably some more horrible and violent characters, both inmates and guards. Which makes sense because we're on death row in that movie. But that is, of course, uplifting also in its own way. Andy, my supposed sole protagonist, is keeping a lot of information from me, but I trust that even though I don't fully understand him until the end, he's consistently characterized, and it's all going to come together. Which it does. That is a lot of why Red, by the end, feels like the true protagonist of the piece to me. Generally, you don't want your point of view character to know too much that you don't know. That makes it hard to get in his head and feel things from his perspective. But that's not, of course, to say that the point of view character is always the protagonist, especially in a lot of movies versus prose. Andy is introduced as what seems like the Eyes-In character, but that shifts later to Red, and rightly so, because Andy is the mystery, and even though he becomes the librarian, it's Red who is more of the open book. I guess you could have told this story without being from Andy's perspective at all at the beginning, and start with Red, but I think then we'd be so distant from him, we'd be suspicious of him too much, suspicious in the wrong way, and he has to tell us some things at the beginning that Red wouldn't know. Red being more of the open book is fun, because he's the guy who can somehow get almost anything someone wants smuggled or delivered into the prison, which is a lot of fun. But he's not the real man of mystery, it's Andy, who asked him for posters of Hollywood starlets going all the way back to the beginning. And it turns out it's to cover the hole he's been digging out of the prison for 2 decades. What a satisfying revelation that was. The movie constantly throws new ways to glue me to the screen at me, always organically and never plot twisty. Andy has all these hobbies, and he looks like he has to be up to something with some of them, but I'm not sure which ones. It turns out some are just hobbies, like the chess pieces he whittles, and others are part of his scheme, like the posters. And there's suddenly a mystery box in the movie, not like an Abrams one, but one that actually pays off in a satisfying way, when Andy tells Red to find an artifact he's buried behind a rock on a farm if he ever gets his parole. So now I know he's got to find that at some point, and I'm really interested to find out what that is. Not just because of the Pandora's box effect. It's not enough to just tell me something is in a box to make me overwhelmingly curious about it. Oh man, there's something in a box. I gotta know what that is. The reason I want to know is because I'm trying to unravel this character, and because I'm starting to see the world from Red's perspective. And he is so curious. He desperately needs a sense of hope, too, more so on the outside than in, because he has been institutionalized and he has no purpose outside those walls. Like the original librarian, the elderly Brooks, get it? His name is Books, with an R in it, who commits suicide in a heart-wrenching montage that will always stay with me, where he tries to live on the outside but just can't function alone without the structure and security of the prison. I love how close Red comes to doing the same thing, and in the very same place, but his friendship with Andy saves him. This is one of the great screen male bonding friendships, and Tim Robbins and Morgan Freeman have a chemistry unlike any I've seen before. Andy is lucky everything works out the way he wants it to, but it's cool when we get to that scene and what's behind the rock isn't something that has always been there, but something Andy planned to put there when he told Red about it. So it wasn't there already when they have that conversation. And his escape from the prison was such a long con, not to mention all the literal chess playing, that I totally buy he'd think to plan something like that and be able to pull it off if Red can get released. And the scene where Red gets his parole is probably the best in the film. It's an incredible speech, brilliantly delivered with equal parts passion and apathy from Morgan Freeman. After we've seen his parole denied time and time again, when we see him simply say, "Yes, I've been rehabilitated," as unconvincingly as possible, he tells the parole board that rehabilitation is just a word that doesn't really mean anything, which really gets to the core of the issue. What is the point of the prison system in this country anyway? Do we really want violent felons to become contributing members of society, to really change into one of us again? Or do we simply want them punished? Red is inadvertently rehabilitated, in my view, despite the prison's policies and against all odds, because he finds his purpose there and matures into a responsible, decent person. He says that the stupid kid who did the crime is gone, and he's what's left, and that's what gets his parole approved. I think the title speaks to this idea. He has been redeemed, but is he even the same person he was when he did the thing that he needed redemption for? Of course, he's responsible for his actions, and everything he and Andy do for the other prisoners does redeem them, perhaps after whatever mistakes they've each made in their lives. But I wonder if it isn't the prison itself that the title is referring to. That it's this horrible place that destroys the human beings who, no matter what they've done, don't deserve the institutionalized, cruel, and unusual punishment that's doled out there. But the prison itself is redeemed, in a way, because it created the adversity these two men needed to become the best of friends, to become better because of that friendship, and to improve the lives of the men around them that society throws away. It's wild to consider that this movie was made in 1994, 5 years before Darabont came back with the almost equally brilliant The Green Mile. I think if I played both of these movies out of order, like I watched them, for somebody that hadn't seen them, they would have no idea which one was made first, that they were 5 years apart, and I think I could easily convince somebody that this movie was made in 2001 or 2003, years from when it actually was produced. The Green Mile is a successor that, while it takes place in the same world and in the same prison, stands completely on its own, but an experience which has to be enhanced by seeing this movie. I saw them out of order, but I'm not sure it matters. They're tackling the same subject from different angles, one decisively more Stephen Kingian than the other. The Shawshank Redemption is more grounded, with no supernatural element alike in The Green Mile, but it's the more feel-good and hopeful of the two. The Green Mile is about an innocent man who does what good he can with a supernatural healing gift while he's still alive, while The Shawshank Redemption is about an innocent man who believes he can be free and ultimately proves it. They're both criticisms of different parts of the same prison, death row and maximum security, respectively. The Green Mile has an altruistic warden who cares about his inmates and is actually the protagonist of the piece, while this film's warden is the villain of the story. It's interesting to contrast him with John Coffey, a perceived villain by everyone in the prison in The Green Mile. One is a prisoner who gives his life to save others through his healing power, while the other is the man in charge of the prison, who kills an inmate to save his own reputation and then dies by his own hand to prevent his own incarceration. I'm sure there are a number of other interesting comparisons and contrasts, but suffice it to say, these are two totally different experiences, different moods, different outlooks that elicit very different emotional responses, but they watch wonderfully well together and give each other more depth by contrast. But I also don't think either requires the other to fully appreciate it as its own story, and might be, in some cases, for different audiences. I know this movie is critically acclaimed and has stood the test of time, so it will come to no shock that I am calling it a masterpiece, but there are a couple of minor complaints I want to address. I do think it's a little too easy that an inmate who shared a cell with Andy's wife's real killer happens to not only come to the same prison he's in and be in the same cell block, but also knows enough about the case that Andy can tell for sure that his wife is the victim he's talking about. That guy is oddly specific in the flashback, as if he knows just what details Andy needs to make a case for a retrial. I'm not saying it couldn't happen, such coincidences are possible, but in such a tight narrative that doesn't rely on any other big contrivances I noticed, that stood out as unlikely, and the only thing that felt manufactured by a screenwriter. It's necessary to move the story along, it creates a wonderfully dramatic situation, and I'm not sure how it could have been handled better, but it was the one thing that took me out. I need another viewing to be sure, but I also wondered retroactively if all the evidence the judge has against Andy in the opening scene makes sense with what we discover actually happened. I also don't think the production does enough to make these characters look 20 plus years older by the end. I guess I'm glad I don't have to watch anyone through heavy makeup, and it does a good job of cluing us into how much time has passed through Freeman's voiceovers. This, by the way, is one of the best examples I have ever seen of necessary and non-intrusive voiceovers. They're wonderful, but because no one seems to age beyond a little gray in Andy's hair by the 60s, I have to keep reminding myself it's not 1947 anymore. I love this movie. I couldn't take my eyes off it. It's kind of hard to stop talking about it. Thanks again to John Early for requesting both Shawshank movies. I feel a little more cultured now. If you'd ever like to request something to be reviewed here on You Made Me Watch, or a comic for the Comic Vault, you can become a $15 patron at patreon.com/geekvolution, and you can do a one-time pledge, which entitles you to one request that'll be put into the rotation, or if you want to regularly be in the rotation, you can stay on there and continue in that tier. Thanks a lot for watching. Once again, I was Captain Logan, and I'll see you again next time, folks.